But as I said, thank you, Paul, for inviting me, Dean Vandenbosch. It's really an honor. I'm learning a ton, and I care deeply about this state, as I know you all do, and it's a pleasure to be able to learn from you and share what I know with you. So basically what I'm going to do is explain very briefly a little bit more about myself and the kind of work that I do, explain what I did in my study of Wisconsin, and then explain how I think it's relevant to the work that you do and just the politics in our state. So without further ado, I am a public opinion scholar and have been my whole career. And generally, when we look at public opinion these days, a question that often comes up is, how can people be so stupid, right? Or putting more diplomatically, how are people getting wrong? What are people getting wrong? I find that question to be deeply problematic because I do believe in democracy, and I think if we take this, spin it out to its full extent, what we're saying is democracy can't work. The ordinary person can't participate in it. So instead of asking, what are people getting wrong, I like to ask the question of how are people understanding their world? Let's think about how they're interpreting the world and the options and the choices in front of them, and then from that, try to better understand the choices that they're making. So back in 2007, I had just earned tenure, and I was designing a study that enabled me to study the way social class identity matters for how people interpret the world, and that allowed me to get out and about around this state that I love. So, in other words, to study understanding, political understanding, by that point in my career, I had realized that the best way to understand how people are interpreting their world is to listen to them. Talk to the people that they know in the settings that they normally spend time in. So I was trying to figure out, how do I study that and drive around this beautiful state and find great places for pie? So that's the honest truth. I was not looking for a rural versus urban divide. I grew up in Grafton, which is about 20 miles north of Milwaukee, between Milwaukee and Sheboygan. I had always thought of myself as a small town Wisconsin girl. Honestly, unfortunately, I know you find this quite naive. It wasn't until I started this study that I realized that Grafton is not small town Wisconsin. Right. I mean, small town Wisconsin, you can fit on the floor of a dorm here at UW-Madison. So this is what I did. I carved up the state into different regions depending on political leanings, type of agriculture, population density, economics, partisanship, and a few other characteristics. And then in each of those regions, I sampled a few communities. I aimed for some small places, some large places. Basically, what I wanted was a wide range of places. I wasn't looking for a perfect cross-section of Wisconsin. I just wanted to have a wide range of places so that I could invite myself into the conversations of people and hopefully hear conversations among a wide range of people. So these are the communities that I spent time in. There's 27 overall. And what I did was, back in 2007, I would call up, God bless UW Extension, I'd call up a local extension office in one of the counties where one of these sampled communities had fell, and I'd say, where in such and such Wisconsin do people go on a regular basis to talk with one another, to visit with one another, that I might get access to? And so here are some pictures that are going to scroll by of some of the different places I went to. Generally, they sent me to diners, gas stations in our smallest communities. You know, gas stations are where people are gathering in the morning. Sometimes McDonald's, sometimes places of worship. Generally, these were early morning coffee clutches among people who were either retired or on their way to work. Depends at the time in the morning, right, which group you catch. I should say that the typical person I encountered was an older white gentleman. Most of the groups, actually, though, were a mix of men and women and a mix of people working and retired. What I did, once I had sampled one of these places and found out, where do people go? Where are the regulars in this community? I would drive out, stay at the closest Super 8 the night before, wake up early, walk in and say, hi, I'm Kathy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Do you mind if I join you this morning? Yeah, right? And, people said sure. They said things like, sure, why not? Or we've got nothing better to do. And then I would say, yeah. And they, you know, like you very politely laughed. I mean, they would look at me like, this is a little odd, but what the heck, right? And I would say, seriously, I study public opinion. I'm really interested in what you all are talking about these days and what your concerns are. And here's my business card, and here's a token of my appreciation, a pen or a Post-it note or a football schedule, not paid for by your taxpayer dollars. I learned to say that. You'll see why. Do you mind if I turn on my recorder? And then I would say, so tell me, what are the big concerns around here? And then they would tell me. And then I had other follow-up questions, and the next time I went back, I'd have other questions to ask, but as much as possible, I tried to listen to what they brought up to me, listen to their concerns, and go from there. So, like I said, there were 27 communities. I ended up spending time with 39 groups across these 27 communities. Some of them I only visited twice. Some of them now, I think I've lost count, but 6, 7, or 8 times. Between 2007 and 2012 is when I did the bulk of my field work. But then when my book was published in 2016, I've gone back around to as many of these as possible to show them the book, give them the book, have a conversation about it. And honestly, I continue to learn things from these folks. And so I continue to go back and ask for what's going on in their minds. About a year in, it was, even though, yes, I was this naive, you know, Milwaukee suburbanite, I guess, it was inescapable that what I was hearing in our smaller communities was really important. It was very intense and pervasive. It was kind of whatever corner of the state I was in, not everyone and not always in the same way, but what I was hearing was this deep resentment toward the cities. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time describing what that sounded like, and then I'll get around to talking why I think it matters. When I would ask people, so what are your big concerns around here? When I started, it's a little bit incidental to the story, but healthcare always came up, taxes and jobs. It varied a little bit by community, but as people were describing those things to me, they would describe our state according to this basic map, that there is Milwaukee and Madison, and then there's the rest of us, which you sometimes call outstate, and we don't like that term. Sometimes they refer to Madison and Milwaukee as the M&Ms. Here's a map of the state, just a visual reminder. Madison and Milwaukee take up a lot of our mental space when we think about the state, but geographically, there's a lot of other territory out there. And people know this and recognize that basically there's the cities, Madison and Milwaukee, are 2 metropolitan areas, and then there's the rest of the state. But in addition to that, what they were telling me was, look, all of the decisions are made down in Madison or in Milwaukee, and then they're communicated out to the rest of us. And we don't have a say. People aren't coming out here to ask us what we think. People aren't coming out here to listen. And so what they were saying is, we don't get our fair share of attention, and we don't get our fair share of power. They were also telling me, all the money gets sucked in by Madison. All of our taxpayer dollars get sucked in by Madison, gets spent on Madison or on Milwaukee, and we don't see that money in return. So there's another way in which they were saying, we are on the short end of the stick. You're not paying attention to us, and you're not giving us the stuff we need in order to thrive. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, they were saying to me, you know, those people making the decisions, they don't know us. They've never lived in a community like this. I mean, they come through and they might have a vacation home, but that's not really making a living here. They don't understand us. They think we're uneducated, unsophisticated, racist, homophobic, Islamophobic, sexist. They don't like us. And so in all of these ways, these folks were telling me, we don't get our fair share of attention, of resources, and respect. Let me illustrate this for you, though, in their words, because it's a little bit hard to convey as I give you the general outlines, but oftentimes when we're having this conversation, it's not doom and gloom, right? I mean, a lot of times people are saying, we choose to live here. We love living here. We love this place. And there's not, I mean, understand, I represent so much of what they're resenting, right? They're welcoming me in, they're warm, they're joking with me, So I want to give it to you in their own words, just to give you a sense of how it comes across. And honestly, I recognize that there are many of you in the audience who are thinking to yourself, no kidding, lady, like this, this is new, right? Yeah, I mean, I've had some amazing and wonderful email correspondence around this project. And I have to say, one of my favorite emails was from a gentleman from a small town who, excuse me, I'm going to swear, but said, no shit, lady, like you're telling me people in the cities don't understand that gas prices are a big deal for us? So I recognize it, I own up to it. But here, in their own words, I'm going to represent the different speakers with my hands like this so I don't interrupt the flow of the conversation. When I go like this is me speaking. In this group, it's in my first year of field work, and I'm speaking with a group of women. It's women only. They meet once a week in a small room in the back of a restaurant in the far northwest corner of the state. And I am asking these folks, as I did and I continue to do, about their attitudes about UW-Madison. We've already been through what they like about Madison, and now I'm asking them, what do you think UW-Madison does not do so well? As a former educator, I resented highly comments such as, there's no education north of Highway 8. Highway 8 cuts east-west across the northern third-ish of the state. We send them such absolutely excellent and well-prepared students there that the attitude that we are the hick area of the state, hick area, like country bumpkin, was painful. And I said, so who did you get that from? From recruiters? Professors? Really? When they would visit here? Yeah, or publish in newspaper articles or other, that was a little distressful because I think northern Wisconsin feels a little far away from Madison anyway. And we keep waving our hands and saying, yoo-hoo, there's another half of a state up here. Up north is not Wausau. Yeah. Okay, so here's another group of people. This is in a lovely hamlet in kind of central, slightly northwest Wisconsin. And these folks are meeting in the basement of a church. They gather every Tuesday morning, and it's some farmers, depending on the season, some retirees, some stay-at-home moms, some business owners. The thing is that there's no business in this hamlet. There's no gas station even, and so people just sort of know that this church basement once a week is the gathering spot. I'm asking them the same question here. What do you think the University of Wisconsin-Madison does not do well? Represents our area. I mean, we're strange to Madison. They want us to do everything from Madison's laws and the way they do things, but we totally live differently than the city people live, so they need to think more rural instead of all this city area. We can't afford to educate our children like they can in the cities. It's as simple as that. We just don't have the advantages. All the things they do based on Madison and Milwaukee, never us. Yeah. We don't have the advantages that they give their local people there, I think, a lot of times, and it's probably because they don't understand how rural people live and what we deal with and our problems. Okay, so those are kind of intense, but now here's a lighter-hearted way in which it came across. So I know I've shared this story with some of you before, so forgive me, but there was one community, central Wisconsin, where I had a hard time finding the group of people. Seemed like no one wanted to tell me where the regulars get together until someone said, well, there's the dice game. Let's, tell her about the dice game. So every morning in one of the restaurants, there's a group of men who play dice. They play ship captain and crew. And I should back up a little. So they play dice, and some of them are on their way to work, some are retired, but they pass along a diner soup cup, and you put your quarter in when it's your turn, and then at 7:25 is the dollar round, and the stakes go up. But the first time I went in, you have to walk through a curtain at the back of the restaurant, and when I walked through the curtain, they stopped playing dice, and they didn't, at the end of the game, they said, so do you know how to play ship captain and crew? And I said, thankfully, yeah, I do. I know how to play ship captain and crew. It's this, you get 3 shakes and you have to roll a 6, a 5, and a 4 in that order, and then the 2 other dice determines how high your roll is. And they said, well, okay, if you want to come back, bring your money with you. So yeah. So Dean Vanden Bosch and other, yes, there's some ethical questions here about one's research when you're gambling with the people that, yes. But yes, so on my third visit, there's a we're shaking dice, and there's a horse auction going on in town. And so I share this story with you to just as an example of how this resentment gets conveyed sometimes. They're asking me if I'm going to the horse auction. I think I'll go up there. Yeah, I went up. I looked through the fence yesterday evening. Oh, why don't you buy one of them horses? I got a trailer. Well, I'm not sure I would keep them. I mean, they know I live kind of close to the football stadium and whatever. I don't have room for a horse, right? Well, I'm not sure where I would keep him. Oh, you keep him in Madison. That's where they keep all the bullshit. Yeah. Well, basically, all you got to do is buy the front end of the horse. They got the back end in Madison, right? Yeah. And we're all laughing. I mean, how, obviously. So we're playing, we're talking and joking and playing dice, and I'm winning this time, and over and over. And so, okay, so it's only 25 cents a bet, but still, I'm 3 years into my fieldwork. I've heard from these guys, I've heard from every corner of the state that, you all in Madison, you come in, you take our money, you leave. So, I'm kind of uncomfortable. So this last bit is me trying to joke with them because I'm so uncomfortable. I say, well, I come and I ask for your money. I come and I ask for your thoughts and I take your money. Oh, I tell you what, that's good though, because we have so little of it. Well, it all goes to Madison anyway, right? Ha ha ha. We expect nothing less from Madison. Oh, at least it won't cost any postage to get it down there now. Yeah. So sometimes it's super lighthearted, right? But the intensity is there. So this rural consciousness thing, all I mean by that is this identity as someone from small town Wisconsin, rural Wisconsin. People aren't saying to me, I identify as a rural Wisconsinite, right? It comes across in different ways. It's, people around here, people like us, people in places like this, they'll refer to it in that way. So it's that identity combined with this sense that we're not getting our fair share of all those things I described before, of power, attention, and resources, and respect. I refer to this as resentment because it's been this low simmering sentiment that's been there for a good long time, well before I started my study, right? And it's powerful because there's so many different parts to it. It's this resentment towards cities and city people, but then towards elites in general, business, academic, cultural elites, one political party more than others, especially as time goes on, and also about racial and ethnic minorities. All of these things, you can tap into one part of it and it can activate the other parts of the overall resentment. And so it's pretty powerful stuff. And it's really fertile ground for politicians. Because on the one hand, and here on this slide I'm talking about, it's fertile ground for arguments against public employees. Because part of what people were saying to me was, we're working really hard to make ends meet, and we're not getting what we deserve. It's supposed to be the case that you work hard and you have a good life, right? It used to be the case in a community like ours where that worked out okay, but it seems to us that what we deserve is going to someone else or somewhere else. And public employees have become a pretty significant target in that respect. Because when I started my field work, well before Act 10, let's just acknowledge, people were saying things to me like, okay, so you're a full-time professor at the university and you're driving around the state playing dice and having coffee? Like, how is that a hard work? How is that a job, right? Or they'll say, public employees, they're mainly sitting behind their desks all day. They're not wearing their bodies out. They have pensions, they have health care, and they get to retire with their bodies intact. It's not the case for a lot of people we know around these parts. And so the notion of who's working hard and who's deserving are very intertwined, and it's been really fertile ground to be able to say public employees, you know what, they have to pay in a bit more to their pot to even things out. It's also been fertile ground, these sentiments have been fertile ground for calls for reducing government programs, and overthrowing government or massive change in government overall, because there's a perception that government is basically an urban thing. Even though there are people, on average, 10% of the workforce in any community in Wisconsin works for a government, there's a perception that the way those folks do their jobs is driven by urban values and urban decisions, whether we're talking about public school teachers, members of the DNR, There's a sense that government is an urban thing. And people will say things to me like, look around here, Kathy, and tell me that whatever government is doing is working for people like us. And so with those sentiments, people pretty readily say, why would we want more of this thing that's not working for us, doesn't respect us, isn't paying attention to us, and hasn't given us the stuff we need in order to thrive? With respect to agriculture in particular, here are some of the things that I've heard. And again, I recognize a lot of this is not going to be new to many of you, but there's a deep pride in rural way of life, right, of which agriculture obviously is a huge component. And yet in perhaps increasingly, some of you could speak to this much better than I, but it seems as though farmers are intertwined with the growing economic inequality across our state, because in some of these places, it's the farmers, some of the farmers who are seen as the wealthy and are somewhat resented. And there are conversations that come up about ag subsidies that are pretty intense and are rifts within friendship groups. I want to give you one example of one of those. So this is in Portage County, or near Portage County, I'm going to say. And this is a group of guys who meet in a warehouse that's owned by one of them that has a business that uses this warehouse. They used to meet in a service station, but the service station went out of business, and so then now they meet in this warehouse. And this is 3 days after the 2016 presidential election. And this is they're pretty politically diverse, and so they have arguments somewhat frequently. But one gentleman who I'll represent with this hand is sort of arguing against agricultural subsidies and saying that they're unfair. And this guy is a farmer and saying, you know, yeah, that, you know, you don't know what you're talking about. So this guy starts off, we're talking about just, I have asked them, do you have faith in democracy? A big general question, and this is something that came up. I think in the voter base, it's messed up right now. It won't get straightened out. There's too many people on the government team right now. Meaning there's too many people getting government subsidies or government programs. This has screwed up the voter base. They expect all the working people to pay for all these people that don't work. And that's basically the Democratic voter base, Democratic Party, is all these giveaway programs and all these aid programs. This is a big farming area, this guy says. You ever hear of farm subsidies? He's saying this to me. That's a giveaway program, the biggest one in the United States history. And we got a lot of conservatives are all, oh, we're going to vote Republican. They're voting for the hand that feeds them because they look in the mailbox and they go, oh, look at them, checks. Ken, not everyone takes those checks. You can go on the website, and I could read you off 40 of them around here that have taken them. So I'm just telling you, that's a big giveaway. When they talk about giveaway programs, that's a hell of a big giveaway in this area. The difference between that giveaway and that program is that those people are working. They do not pay their fair share in taxes because I pay 3.5 times. I have property in northern Wisconsin. I pay 3.5 times more than any farmer pays on 160 acres around here. And mine is in a managed forest program. I still pay 3.5 times more. That's not right. When you're in a big rural area where you have all this, he's kind of waving his hands out around the window, and they're not paying, just saying, we're kind of depressed in that area, looking for money. Every municipality is looking for money. Aids have been cut to the schools, and we've got all these so-called conservatives, but they're worried about their own pocketbook, just like they're belly aching and crying about the Democrats waiting for their handouts. It kind of goes both ways. Didn't mean to start an argument, but that's a fact. And you can go on a website in any county in the state and see where that money goes. And then the gentleman I'm calling Joe changes the subject. That's one example of how the ag subsidies can be a rift in these communities. Now, for a few words about attitudes about UW-Madison, UW Extension, which you can probably guess what I'm about to say. But when I asked folks about what does UW-Madison do well, these are some of the responses that came up. This is a beloved institution, and I mean that, the set of institutions. I mean, people around the state, are very proud about the UW system, about their system, their local system school, and about UW-Madison. I can't tell you, I should count, but I haven't, the number of times in these hundreds of conversations when I've walked into a group unannounced and people are wearing their Badger gear, right? Now, I think that that is important. You can look at this list and laugh and say the first thing that comes up is sports. It's often, for many people, the main connection they have to this institution, and I think that's really important to recognize. But they had many things to say, and yes, UW Extension comes up readily when I ask people, what does UW-Madison do well, even before the merger. When I say, what does it not do well, people have things to say, and you've heard a few of them. But these responses tend to be lengthier, they have more to say. And I'll just remark on the last one here, faculty being lazy, liberal, and elitist. Yes, they know I'm a political science professor, right? And yet they tell me, they don't hold back. They say, you know, how often are you in the classroom? How many classes are you teaching a week, right? There's this perception. I don't know, it's amazing to me. It's so different than people's perception of the Packers. Like, how long are the Packers on the field every week, right? A couple hours? They're working their arses off all week, right? Okay, so I'm not a Packer. But anyway, there's a perception that we don't work very hard, that we have TAs teaching our class for us, that we're predominantly liberal and indoctrinating our students, and that we're elitist. And the elitist part, I think, is worth paying a little attention to, because they mean it in several respects. They mean you all think you're better than the rest of us, kind of elitist, but also you all are making a heck of a lot of money, and you have health care, and you have pensions, and compared to the average person around the state of Wisconsin, we have it pretty good. And people pick up on that. Just a few final notes I want to bring up. That I think it's important to recognize that all this stuff about not getting one's fair share and feeling like we're on the short end of the stick, and the perception that all the money's going to Madison and Milwaukee, all of this stuff was in place well before the Great Recession. So it's not product of the Great Recession or of the Walker administration. These things were in there. And you might even be saying to yourself, well, the rural versus urban divide has always been there. It was there when I was a kid. It was there in ancient Rome. I mean, it's always been the case that cities have sort of had more than the ones left outside the city, right? I do think, though, that there's something particular about this point in history, in our state and in the country, because it's a confluence of so many things coming together. Technology, the way we communicate, mobilization in terms of economically and also where we choose to live, changes in agriculture, right, goes without saying for this group, and also the ways politics is coinciding with rural versus urban. Again, not new, but in this particular way, it's pretty important. And you can also, you know, there are small communities in our state that have always been rural and would have always called themselves rural, but were extremely prosperous at one point in time, right? There are communities in our state where that now have boarded up main streets, which also still have standing homes with ballrooms on the 3rd floor, right? Especially in former logging communities. And there's a pretty intense sense that that has disappeared and isn't coming back anytime soon. You might also be asking, are their claims legitimate in terms of where the resources go? And I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but I'm going to show you a series of graphs, just my own calculations that I did, looking at where taxpayer dollars go and where they're pulled in from. And these graphs show there's dots, it's just dot plots, and each dot represents one county in the state. And what I've done is arrayed the counties by rurality according to census categorizations, and then plotted how many state taxpayer dollars are pulled in, given back, and then a fair share calculation that kind of takes both into account, meaning given how much people pay in, how much are they getting back on a per capita basis in the counties. And what I'm going to show you in the first view with respect to state taxes and federal taxes, that is, with, if anything, in our rural communities, they're getting slightly more than their so-called fair share. But then I'm going to throw you three more graphs, which will make anyone pause who says rural communities have it pretty well economically. So here's state aid being paid back to the states on a per capita basis, state tax dollars being pulled in. So farther on that side are more rural counties. And then here's the fair share calculation with respect to state taxpayer dollars. So again, if anything, rural communities a little bit better off than our more urban counties. But now here are the three other graphs. Median household income in our rural communities, quite a bit lower than our urban counties, right? Percentage below the poverty line, pretty significant in our rural communities, and the unemployment rate, pretty significant in our rural communities too. Here's a few more graphs just to round out the other stories you've heard today and other graphs you've seen about how difficult people in our predominantly rural counties have it. This is recovery. This is a graph from the USDA. This is recovery since the recession. The dark top line is our metro areas nationwide, right? Jobs have come back. The bottom, this is nationwide again, not so much, right? And this is important, I think, because when you are living in a small community in Wisconsin or elsewhere and you're seeing the headlines about recovery and growth, it reinforces this notion of, see, they have no idea what it's like in a place like this. Have they been here? Have they talked to people like us? And finally, this is broadband. So blue is not so great broadband access download speeds. Orange is pretty good, what we're used to in Madison. In other words, a wide swath of the country has very difficult time getting on the internet, right? And this matters a lot for farmers, for job applications, for job training, and for education. So just one other way in which things are pretty challenging in our rural communities. So I'm going to skim through this a little bit just to come back around to a few more uplifting points. But Wisconsin, in many respects, as I've been describing it, was a bellwether state. When Scott Walker ran for governor in 2010 and then proposed Act 10, this was the response in Madison, right? But the response not that far out of Madison was, it's about time. Public employees should pay in more to the pot. And so the ways Scott Walker has tapped into this resentment have been copied, I don't know if copied is the right word, but replicated by politicians elsewhere. And you can see some of this in the Trump campaign as well. Two final points. One is that sometimes people interpret the support for President Trump or support for Republican candidates in general as a sign that what people are wanting is less government. And what I have learned from this fieldwork is that sometimes that's the case. Sometimes it's a sort of a principled stance that the less government, the better. But more often the way it comes across is people wanting a government that attends to their concerns and that listens and respects who they are as human beings. When I ask people, so which party better represents people around here? The immediate response almost everywhere is, well, neither. Neither party represents people like me. And so it seems to me that and other comments conveys that what people want is a government that listens and respects them. Agriculture, in many ways, is one way in which we might bridge this divide. And I say that because I think Steve Ventura just had to leave, but there's a variety within the state of Wisconsin. There's a variety of exciting things going on, and I'd love to hear more of them from you that you know of about urban agriculture and also urban folks becoming interested in agriculture and trying to bridge with rural communities through food, through agriculture. So this logo I put up is from the project that Steve Ventura and others have been working on. I think, is Greg Lawless still in the room? Right on. All right, so if you aren't familiar with it, They recently released this book, Good Food, Strong Communities, that's about this fabulous project they've been working on, both in urban communities in Wisconsin, but around the nation. And this is an example of bringing agriculture to an urban setting in a pretty exemplary extension type way, in which people in the community are being listened to, and they're full collaborators in the project. And that's one way in which you see, agriculture coming into cities. And here's another example that I don't know a whole lot about, but Josh Morrill in DCS has informed me about, which sounds pretty fantastic to me. So Fermentation Fest. Have any of you been to Fermentation Fest in the past? Yeah, fabulous. So, it's taking advantage of the interest in food among many people across the state and bringing them out to a beautiful rural part of our state, both to learn more about food and different types of fermented food, of which we have many grand examples, and at the same time using art to bring people together. So one of the great art installations that was in a past Fermentation Fest that I've been told about was this long clothesline, a 3-mile long rainbow clothesline. And the idea was to draw people out of the cities into the beautiful parts of the state to learn more about food and agriculture, and to bring people together around art. So there are many ways, I think, that the common thread of food and agriculture can be a way in which we learn to communicate with one another. I realize we have a long way to go and a whole lot of understanding to create, but there is potential there. So I realize what I've had to say, a lot of it, despite the dice game, is pretty sobering. But I really appreciate your attention, and I really look forward to connecting with many of you personally and hearing more from you now in the few moments we have together for discussion. But like I said, I'll be back later on, so please pull me aside if there's something that I ought to know, or things that we could talk about productively together. So thank you so much for your attention.